Have you ever watched a sequel to an MCU movie and thought to yourself, boy, this movie sure seems different from the last one. The tone feels different. The characters seem different. Some characters from the previous movie don't show up in this one with no mention or hint as to what happened to them. Today, we will discuss the inconsistencies with these MCU movies and their sequels to explore why they seem different from one another.
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know.
Many of the current MCU movies do have sequels, and some of them have their trilogies set and finished in the second or third phase of the MCU timeline. For purposes of this video, we will be going in release order of these movies and trilogies. Being that we are going in order, it's only appropriate to start with the movie that began the MCU as we know it, Iron Man. If you did not know, Iron Man and Iron Man 2 released in Phase 1 of the MCU. Both of these films were directed by Jon Favreau, whom previously had a role as Foggy in the 2004 Daredevil movie, starring Ben Affleck. Jon Favreau has many acting credits, but doesn't have many notable writing credits, and is credited as a director in a few TV shows and TV movies, along with a video game adaptation of Thor. Despite his lack of major director spots, Jon Favreau's Iron Man and Iron Man 2 were done fairly well. Iron Man is definitely a classic, and Iron Man 2 built upon everything that Iron Man 1 set up, despite the recasting of Rhodey from Terrence Howard to Don Cheadle. Now, with all that being said, we should discuss the first trilogy Inconsistency in this list. Now, with Iron Man and Iron Man 2 both being directed by Jon Favreau, it goes without saying that these two movies are mostly consistent. We come to the biggest inconsistency with the release of Iron Man 3, which is directed by Shane Black, who previously made his directorial debut on Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, but also worked as a writer on the entire Lethal Weapon series, the movies, not the TV show, The Long Kiss Goodnight, and The Last Action Hero, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. With this information, it shouldn't come as any surprise that Iron Man 3 is tonally different from the previous two movies. Jon Favreau was known previously for his acting, mostly as comedic relief, whereas Shane Black, up to this point, was known mostly behind the scenes as a writer with more serious, semi-action filled films. With Shane's more serious, dark style, we can see why Iron Man 3 turned out to be done in a different style from Iron Man 1 and 2, not to mention the difference in storytelling between these movies. Iron Man was focused on Tony's road, fixing his company's objective of selling weapons to the highest bidder, and making peace rather than war due to his capture and escape at the hands of the Ten Rings, thanks to his mentor, Obadiah Stane. During these events is when we are introduced to Iron Man. Iron Man 2 continues the story of 1 in that Tony is facing the aftermath of his escape from the first movie due to his own rocket exploding, leaving shards of metal in his body and attempting to find a way to keep said shards from getting closer to his heart, all the while facing his second protagonist, Whiplash. Iron Man 3 sees a mix between Tony trying to stop a fake terrorist while being stuck in New Jersey and also dealing with his PTSD from the events of the Avengers film. This movie has a lot of Christmassy vibes from the Lethal 1 and Lethal 2 movies, whereas Iron Man 3 does not touch upon any of the events or themes that were introduced in the previous two films. Really, the only things that were brought over were Tony's relationship with Pepper, which is also a big theme with Tony's character throughout the remainder of his arc through the end of Phase 3. Moving on, we should discuss the second trilogy that the MCU completed by Phase 3, Captain America. The first film, The First Avenger, we see as a period film directed by Joe Johnston, whom had previously directed the original Jumanji film starring Robin Williams, along with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Jurassic Park 3. Marvel Studios tends to give a lot of chances to directors who don't have much directorial work. So far, Joe Johnston has the most experience prior to The First Avenger, but only has a few credits since this movie's release. Now, if this movie seems tonally different from the other two Captain America movies, that's because Marvel Studios switched gears and went with the Russo brothers, Anthony and Joe Russo. The Russo brothers went on to finish the Captain America trilogy and also proceeded to wrap up the third and fourth Avengers films. With this pairing in charge of the overall story arc of these four films, it makes sense why the first Avenger was so much different the knees and looks like the red-headed stepchild. To the Russo brothers' credit, they did build upon many of the ideas brought forward from the first Avenger, giving them more creative control and consistency with the remainder of the Captain America trilogy. The third trilogy, which is a loosely used term now given the release of current films, is Thor. In the first three phases of the MCU, Thor received its first three films, all with different directors. Yes! The first film was brilliantly done by Kenneth Branagh, a well-known Shakespearean actor and director. This set a good tone and story for the first Thor film. Thor: The Dark World brought in Alan Taylor, who previously worked as a director on TV episodes for numerous series such as Mad Men, Oz, 6 Feet Under, and Sex and the City. Since The Dark World, he has directed Terminator Genesis, as well as several episodes of Game of Thrones. He tried his best to carry over the story, feel, and themes from the first Thor film, but he certainly is no Kenneth Branagh. This is why I feel the film did poorly, because it seemed as though the director tried to bring in as much of Kenneth Branagh into his work as possible, and it just didn't translate well. I also feel due to the poor performance of this film, that's why we see another directorial switch for Thor Ragnarok. Now, despite another switch, this switch ended up being in the best interest for Thor, as it allowed the franchise to be the first film to have a fourth film in the MCU. Thor Ragnarok is more lighthearted, both in terms of its themes and imagery, making it, in my opinion, more successful than the previous two films. But now that we have the fourth film released, with the same director as the third film, both of these films are very similar due to keeping the same director, allowing him to use the same things that worked for Ragnarok and bring it over to Thor: Love and Thunder. Now, the only other trilogy as of writing and filming of this video is Spider-Man, a trilogy that has been brought to us in collaboration with Sony and Columbia Pictures, as well as Marvel Studios. This is the very first trilogy in the MCU that has the same director across all of its MCU outings. And with this, we can see that everything is consistent here. The story, despite the little timeline error at the beginning of Homecoming, but across the Spider-Man films alone, everything else is consistent, including its imagery, actors, story, jokes, and everything else. As this is the first MCU trilogy with the same director across all three films, this is the prime example of how keeping the same director works wonders for the trilogy. The next trilogy in the MCU that will have had the same director across all three films will be Ant-Man, with Quantumania being the third film to keep Peyton Reed on board with all three films. After this, we will see James Gunn returning with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, giving the MCU its third trilogy with its same director. Now, with these two trilogies not yet being finished, we have to wait to see how the third entries fare for the rest of their respective entries. If I missed anything with the MCU and its trilogies, let me know down in the comments. P.S. I didn't really compare the Avengers films in this list, as technically there are 4 Avengers films so far in the MCU, not really making them a trilogy. The first 2 being directed by Joss Whedon, and the next 2 being directed by the Russo brothers. And the only reason I compared Thor was due to me starting the writing of this script prior to the release of Thor: Love and Thunder. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you have any video suggestions, please leave them down in the comments below. If you want to check out my MCU playlist, you can check that out on the right, and you can check out my Blade teaser video here on the left. Thanks again, and I'll catch you on my next video.